Okay, thank you all for coming, and I hope this will be an interesting talk for you. I'm going to take you through the history and the technology and the deciphering of the Enigma right up to today. We start out with World War I. World War I was a bit of a disaster for Germany. Germany was not only split into two pieces with Poland in the middle, but also the Treaty of Versailles mandated that there be no German army and no German air force and no German navy. Now, obviously, the Germans were not too happy about that. Their leader at the time screamed and yelled and said, "We want our country back in one piece. We want to do other things to rebuild Germany." And he screamed and yelled, but quietly on the side, he was quietly building up an illegal army, a navy, and air force. He trained his army by training his soldiers to be in hunting clubs. He trained his air force pilots as pilots in local gliding clubs. This was all to keep the world from knowing that he was building up his military. And finally, he trained his navy, and especially the U-boats, in local sailing clubs. They learned to sail, but they weren't really only learning to sail, they were learning to do all kinds of tactics and maneuvers. In order to keep this secret from the world, he still had to communicate with all of these units. And after World War I, Hitler discovered, and the Germans discovered that all of their messages in World War I were being read by the British. The British had dived on a sunken ship and brought up the code books and were able to read the German messages from World War I. And Germans didn't know that until after World War I, but they knew it by the time they started building up their military, and they knew they couldn't use the old techniques for coding messages. They had to find something new. And the something new was the Enigma machine. They used the Enigma to hide all of their illegal buildup of military, as well as the other things that they were doing in concentration camps and so on. They considered the Enigma to be totally and completely secure. Their U-boats were extremely, extremely effective during the war. They took a terrible toll on all of the Allies. They sank over 3,000 ships, consisting of 3 million tons of cargo, and in the process they killed 150,000 men by sinking those ships. And those were the U-boats, primarily, that were sinking those ships, and they were extremely deadly. Very, very scary stuff. Every U-boat had an Enigma machine on board and a second Enigma machine on board in case the first one ran into trouble. And there's a picture of an Enigma operator on a German U-boat. The Enigma itself is rather interesting. We'll start out with its origin. Several people invented the Enigma machine in various countries in one form or another, but a man named Arthur Scherbius was the first to patent it and to build one. And he built this god-awful thing over here, weighed over 300 pounds. It cost about the equivalent of $15,000. And he was trying to sell it to companies to use in their internal security. He failed miserably. We don't know whether he ever even sold one of these, but someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, by the way, why don't you try a little cheaper, smaller model?" And so he put together this one over here, and we'll talk about this. This is the way the Enigma looked all through the war. The Germans stuck with this design all the way from the original design to the end of the war, and that was perhaps one of their problems, sticking with the design without changing the basics of the design. The Enigma machine is a letter substitution machine. It encodes messages by having you type in a letter, and it will then generate a different letter. The letter you type in is called the plain text letter, and the letter that is indicated by a light bulb lighting up is called the ciphertext letter. So we're typing in a plain text A, and we're getting out a ciphertext H. And without an Enigma machine, you don't know that that H corresponds to the letter A. Let's go back to the Civil War and look at how letter replacement encoding works. In the Civil War, they used something called a code wheel, and this dates all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar, who used a similar code. And a code wheel and the Caesar code simply take the normal alphabet and slide it over with respect to letters to some other letters in the same normal alphabet. So let's look at how the code wheel works. The code wheel is first of all set to what is called the encoding key, or the day's key. And in this case, the day's key is A is across from H. The plain text letter A is the equivalent of the ciphertext letter H. And you can rotate this wheel to change the day's key every day, so it's different each day. Let's encode my name, Tom, with this wheel. T goes in as the plain text, and out comes an A, O becomes V, and M becomes T. My name, Tom, has now become AVT. You take that AVT and it's meaningless, but you carry it over to someone else who has a code wheel, say some other general with a code wheel, and if he is set to the same day's key, then you go in and you take your A and you hook it into the innermost wheel here and read the plain text letter T out. You read the T out, you put in the V and you read O, and you put in the T and you read M. So you use this wheel for both enciphering and deciphering letters, letter replacement. Let's see how it works in the Enigma machine. Remember I said you press a keyboard key, A, and a light bulb over here lights up. This is the wiring diagram of an Enigma, how it looks inside. And let's push that letter A down and see what happens. We have a battery over here, and the voltage from that battery comes through the key that you've closed, the letter A, and into the plug board on the front of the Enigma. That's a bunch of wires that's right on the front here of the Enigma machine. The plug board changes the letter A over to some other letter, in this case the letter O. And you then watch as the electrical voltage from the letter O on the plug board goes through the rotors, which are rotating wired connections, all the way through the rotors from the right to the left. They then go into a reflector and come back from left to right, and they come out of this rotor stack. They went in as an O and they come out as an M. Now the letter M is connected to the M on the plug board, which is connected over by the plugs on the plug board to an H, and the voltage finally goes through the H light bulb and lights up the letter. If you look at this carefully, you'll notice that there is nothing any more complicated here than a regular flashlight. You press a switch, and you have a battery, and a light bulb lights up. So an Enigma machine is basically a flashlight with a few more wires thrown in. How do we use it? Well, here's our Enigma machine, and we type the letter A into the keyboard, and the letter H lights up on the light bulb panel. Now we got to take that H, which is the ciphertext version of A, and we've got to get it over to a deciphering Enigma somehow. And this was done either by a messenger, or by radio, or by telephone. If it was sent by radio, the Allies were able to intercept it. They couldn't very well intercept telephone calls or messengers, but they could intercept radio. And happily, the Germans sent a lot of their messages by radio. Now, the decoding Enigma, which is set to exactly the same overall setting or day's key as the encoding Enigma, if you type your encoded, your ciphertext letter H into the decoding Enigma, by God, there it goes, the letter A lights up. So the decoding Enigma is capable of taking the H and converting it back into the plain text letter A. Let's trace that through in the wiring. Down here, we see pressing the letter H in the bottom. We watch the voltage come up into the plug board. The wiring is exactly the same as it was when we encoded A to H. It's just going through backwards. So the plug board converts the H over to an M. The M goes into the rotor stack and comes out as a O. The O goes into the plug board and is converted to an A, and the A ultimately lights up the A light bulb. So we've seen electrically how an Enigma machine can encode and decode a message. And you put that together with two Enigma machines here. We see the A being typed into the keyboard here, lights up the letter H, that's the ciphertext. We get the letter H, write it down and carry it over, radiate over to a decoding Enigma, type it into the decoding Enigma, and we notice that the letter as an H, and we notice the letter A lights up. So we've encoded and decoded with these two machines. Now the neat thing about the Enigma, the thing that the Civil War code wheel couldn't do, is that the Enigma changes its internal wiring, those wires that we saw, every single time you type in a letter. So if I were to type in the letter A again, and the Enigma rotors have moved now one step, we get a very different ciphertext. We get the letter X. And every time you type a letter into the Enigma, the rotors rotate one step and change the relationship between the input key and the output key. Here we are again with our two Enigmas. Again, we've typed in the second letter A, we get an X, we carry the X over to a decoding Enigma, and we type it in, and we get back the letter A. So that is an attempt to explain how the Enigma works mechanically and electrically. It's very, very simple in terms of that, but the thing that's not simple is the so-called days key of the Enigma. There are four components that constitute this initial setting. Remember, I said the initial setting is very important. The four different components of the day's key each contribute complexity. And let's take the simplest one first, and that is which of the 5 rotors that you can have available to you, 2 in a box and 2 or 3 in the Enigma, is located in which position along the axle. Is number 1 on the left, is number 2 on the left, what's in the middle, and so on. So you have 3 rotors, and you have a possible 5 rotors. How many different possible settings are there, or ways of adjusting the 5 rotors into those 3 settings? And it turns out there are 60 of those. Each rotor, as we saw in the video, has an internal ring setting. And there are a total of 26 ring settings for each rotor. But if you take 26 settings in one rotor, 26 in the other, 26 in the other, that means a total possible number of internal ring settings of 676. Then we have the starting positions of each rotor. Each rotor, when you set it with your thumb wheel, shows a number in the little window out front. And if you look at all the possible combinations of settings of the rotor, it comes out there's 17,576 of those. And finally, we get to the really complicated stuff, and that is where the plugs are set in the plug board. And you could have anywhere from 0 plugs in there up to 13 cables, and they could be in any of the 26 holes there. So the total number of possible jumper cable selections on the plug board is 5 times 10 to the 15th, a very large number. But talking about large numbers, the total possible number of days keys for a 3-rotor Army or Air Force Enigma is 10 to the 114th power. By you take all those combinations together, you get 10 to the 114th power. That's a huge number, especially when you figure that there are only 10 to the 80th power atoms in the entire observable universe. So this is a big, big number. And guess who knew how big a number it was? The head of the U-boats. He knew that the chances of the Allies guessing which one of the 10 to the 114th power possible initial settings was the setting for that day was virtually non-existent. You'd have to spend hundreds and hundreds of years trying each setting before you hit upon the proper setting. So he was head of the U-boats, and he felt very good about his U-boats, so good that he demanded that every single one of his U-boats send back to him a message every day in which they reported their GPS latitude, longitude position. So they were literally broadcasting their latitude and longitude. No GPSs back then, but they used various techniques for getting their position, sending back to Dönitz their exact position every single day. And he was so confident that there was no possibility that anyone would be able to guess the correct day's setting, that he insisted that every one of his boats report back every single day. And of course, those messages being sent by radio were intercepted by the Allies. And the Allies got these messages and they said to themselves, God, I wish we could decode those. But they weren't very good at it, and the U-boats kept on sinking more and more of these ships. And this is the point where, if you saw the movie Imitation Game, Alan Turing steps forth and jumps ahead and has this great epiphany and discovers how to crack the enigma. Well, it's all a lie, as I'm going to tell you in a minute. Alan Turing did not discover how to crack the enigma. However, this scene is particularly dear to my heart because that enigma down there is one that I found and restored, and the one that starred in the movie Imitation Game. So that part was good, but the fact that the director would not consider the real story of the enigma in the Imitation Game and had to play Alan Turing as the hero was the upsetting part. In addition, here we see Alan Turing, so-called, in front of this incredible machine that he has designed and built to crack the Enigma code. And if you remember the movie, oh, we finally got it to work and all that. Well, he wasn't the first person to design it. So who was? Indeed, it was three brilliant Polish mathematicians who broke the Enigma code first and broke it 6 years before the war started, at which point Alan Turing started working on it. So the Poles had broken the code 6 years before Alan Turing broke into the code. And it was indeed their discoveries that they gave to Alan Turing that allowed Turing to break into the code. And how did that all happen? Well, as I said, Germany was split in two parts by the Treaty of Versailles, and Poland was caught in the middle, and the Poles knew that they were going to be first to be invaded. There was no question. And so they devoted an immense amount of energy and time into trying to crack the German Enigma codes. And they were the first people to actually enlist mathematicians to try and break the code. Somehow it had never occurred to the British that mathematicians might be good at breaking codes. Ridiculous. Anyway, here are the three incredibly brilliant Polish mathematicians led by Marian Rejewski and with Henryk Zygalski and Jurek Rosiecki. And these three Polish mathematicians not only figured out exactly what the internal wiring of the Enigma was, but they built the first Enigma deciphering machines, which they named bombas. And what do we mean by figuring out the wiring of the Enigma code? Well, every Enigma rotor has a wiring matrix inside it that connects an input pin over here where the voltage comes in over to an output pin over here where the voltage goes out. And the question is, which pin here is connected to which pin over there? It's different in all 5 of the rotors, and it's very difficult to calculate. And the Poles figured that out by getting a decoded message and a coded message, an encoded message, and comparing them and trying to figure out how the rotors were wired. Once they had done that, the Poles actually built several Enigma replicas. They had the local company build these, and very similar in appearance to the Enigma, and they used these to help them decipher the German Enigma messages. Then they built a device which they named a bomba. Nobody's really sure why they named it that. It's the name of a Polish dessert. It's also the name of a bomb which ticks as it operates. On the left we have a manual bomba, in which you have Enigma rotors over here, Enigma rotors over here, and you spin them, and you look for coincidences, and little lights light up on the front. And over here, a later version, which has an electric motor down here that spins the rotors around and lights up lights on the front and helps them to figure out the day's key for the Enigma. From 1933 to 1939, using their bombs, the Poles were able to decipher many German Enigma messages 6 years before Poland was invaded by Germany. Then Germany invaded Poland, and luckily the Polish mathematicians escaped. They first went to France, and then they escaped to England, taking all their knowledge and their plans with them. So they were able to teach the French and the British how to decipher the Enigma messages. Actually, the information ended up in Alan Turing's hands in Bletchley Park, and from 1939, the British took over code breaking in this estate called Bletchley Park, and they deciphered German messages using the Polish technology for the rest of the war. The deciphered messages, when they were deciphered into readable text, were known as Ultra, and Ultra revealed all the plans of the Germans, virtually everything the Germans were doing, as well as the location of every single German submarine in the ocean. 10,000 code breakers working in Bletchley Park kept their secret of what they were doing, not only till the end of the war, but they were threatened with death if they ever revealed what they were doing during the war. And so the 10,000 people, not one of them ever revealed the secret that the Brits had cracked the Enigma code, and consequently nobody knew about it until 30 years after the war. That's 1975. An amazing feat of secrecy on the part of the British. Alan Turing was, of course, a brilliant mathematician, and he knew immediately what to do with the Polish information. He took the Polish bomba, the electrically operated one, and he used that information to help him construct the Turing-Welchman bomb, which is much more complex and much, much faster than the model that the Poles used. But he never gave credit to the Poles for having taught him, essentially, how to do this. This is the back of the Turing-Welchman bomb. It's quite a complex machine, much more complex than the Polish machine. The Poles didn't have the technology capability to build machines like this, but it's amazing that they were able to crack the codes as well as they were. As the war went on, it became apparent that the Germans were building new kinds of cipher machines at the very end of the war, and so Turing designed a machine which was called Colossus, which is often thought of as being the very first digital computer to decipher the German messages. And if you look at it, then the need to decipher the Enigma was part of cryptology's role in the early development of computer technology. Look at the Enigma machine, and you see that it led to the Polish bomb, the other Polish bomb, the British bomb, the British Colossus, and the Americans also built a bomb in the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio. So the American bomb was a spin-off from this need to decipher the Enigma, and that then led to the development of more and more complex computers. So we're really looking at the birth of the computer age when we talk about the Enigma decoding bombs. But what nobody has really mentioned yet anywhere in print is my contention that the Enigma itself was maybe the first early computer. So what is a computer? Computer has an input, typically a keyboard, has a display, typically a screen or light panel or something, and it has a central processing unit. The CPU contains at least two things, a programmable memory and a stored program. And we compare that with what we have in an Enigma machine. We have the keyboard, clearly on the front of an Enigma. We have a central processing unit which, as we've seen, is not only programmable in terms of the day's key, but it has a memory in that it stores what to do with the day's key as you type in letters, and it also has a display. So why not consider the Enigma as the first laptop computer? And for that matter, if you're going to do that, how about the Enigma as the first notebook computer, and maybe the Enigma as the first smartphone? I'll leave you to argue about that one if you wish, but we'll go on with a little bit more of what we need to discuss. The capture of code books from U-boats helped Turing in deciphering the Enigma because a code book told the day's key for an entire 30-day period. And so the Allies tried to capture code books. It's hard to capture a submarine, though, because the subs are hard to capture. First of all, and the code books are made in such a way that if you get them wet, the writing on them disappears. So it was a difficult problem. Repeated, predictable words in messages was widely used by both the Poles and by Turing, and many, many other discoveries and techniques were used in cracking the Enigma. This is just a picture of one of the German U-boats, U-505, being captured and boarded in order to remove its code books. Deciphering of the German Enigma messages had to be hidden really carefully from the Germans. They didn't want the Germans to know that we were reading their messages, because if they had known that, they would have stopped using the Enigma. So Churchill had difficult decisions to make, whether to, for instance, call out or evacuate the town of Coventry, which he had learned through the Enigma messages was about to be bombed, or whether to let it be bombed in order to preserve the secret that they were able to decode the Enigma. The decision is not agreed upon by historians, but many ethical problems were raised by the fact that we were able to read the Enigma messages and in the process had to sacrifice some lives in order to keep the secret. The World War II U-boats, 784 out of 1,152 were sunk, mostly due to the Enigma deciphering. 28,000 crewmen out of the 48,000, 70%, died. And the Enigma deciphering itself was thought of as having shortened the war by 2 years, saved thousands of lives, and possibly prevented Hitler from completing the atomic bomb, which would have been a terrible disaster. But decoding the Enigma was not the only way that the Enigma was defeated. The Germans were dumb enough to force prisoners of war to build their Enigmas for them. I don't have a picture of Germans building an Enigma machine, but I do have pictures of the prisoners of war here building BMW engines, and in this picture they are assembling highly, highly technical guidance systems for the V-2 guided rocket. And it is likely that they also were made to assemble Enigma machines. Now, of course, if you're assembling something for the enemy, you want to make that thing not work. And if you do it in any obvious way, you know you're going to get shot in the factory. So they had to dream out the way of sabotaging the Enigmas without getting caught. And that meant that the Enigma had to pass inspection as it left the factory and then fail in the field. And let's see how they did that. We've been restoring Enigmas now for 35 years or so, and we've had at least 60 Enigmas apart, and we have come across some amazing things. This is a plug from the plug board on the front of an Enigma that we discovered just rattling around inside an Enigma machine. And it looked perfectly innocent, as though maybe it fell in there, but this plug had never been wired before. And you could tell by looking in it, the screws had never been used in it, which meant the plug probably had either dropped in there by accident or been dropped in there on purpose. I'll choose on purpose because the Enigma machine is going to work perfectly well with that little plug on there until it jiggles its way up to the very front of the machine and blocks this bar from coming down. Every time you push a key, the bar comes down. It has to go all the way down with the little plug there, it can't go all the way down, and the Enigma machine fails. Okay? Oh, you could argue with that one. How about this one? This was sabotage, we think, by a fishhook, which was dropped into the wiring of the computer, of the Enigma. And you can see the fishhook here. I've sort of pointed it out with arrows. And the point gradually works its way through the insulation and shorts out the wiring. So that's possible sabotage technique too. Here's another one. These screws that are used to screw the wires into the plugs themselves are supposed to be short enough so that you can tighten them down and snug the wires really down well. We found some screws that were too long, and they left the wires sort of a little shaky. And that means that the wires could have not made good contact, and the Enigma could have failed in the field. And there were a lot of other possible ways in which they were sabotaged. At the end of the war, it was clear to the Germans that the Allies were coming in and that they really shouldn't leave their Enigma machines lying around. So they actually destroyed their Enigmas by jumping on them, shooting them, and in various ways incapacitating them. And Churchill, at the end of the war, just after the end of the war, ordered that every single Enigma machine and Enigma decoding bomb and the plans and papers be destroyed. And we always wondered about why did Churchill order every Enigma destroyed? You can see why Hitler and the Germans would want them destroyed, but why Churchill? And the answer turned up when we discovered an Enigma with, hold your breath, a Hebrew keyboard. Hebrew keyboard. How can you have an Enigma with a Jewish Hebrew keyboard on it? That was the big question. It took us several years, many of us historians hunting around. We finally found the machine in Israel and tracked down the story. And the story was that Churchill had secretly given 30 Enigma machines to the Israelis at the end of the war. And he wanted everyone to believe that they were all destroyed, but he said, here, take these Enigma machines and use them for your internal military intelligence. They're really secure. He didn't bother to tell them that the British had cracked the Enigma code, so he had a neat way of potentially reading the Israeli military communications for years and years after that. The only thing that ran into problem was that a man who had worked at Bletchley Park was an Israeli, came back to Israel, and he was sworn to lifetime secrecy about the cracking of the Enigma code, so he couldn't go to Ben Gurion and say, hey, don't use those machines, the British can read the code. Instead, he went to Ben Gurion and he said, I see that you have some Enigma machines here that you're going to use for the military. Have you ever heard of the Trojan horse? And Ben Gurion got the message, and they didn't use the Enigma machines in Israel, but he had given a lot of machines also to other countries like Spain, South America, Norway, and they did use the Enigmas during the war, and the British were able to decipher it. The Russians, of course, also captured a lot of Enigma machines at the end of the war, and although they thought Churchill had discarded all the Enigma cracking, decoding machines, he hadn't, and so Churchill was able to read the Russian Enigma-coded messages after the end of the war. Very few Enigmas survived the war. Most of them went down in battlefields. 99% of all the Enigmas that were made, about 25,000 Enigmas were made, and 95% of those were destroyed, 99%. So there are only about 250 Enigma machines that are known to exist at this point. And the reason is that they were really well destroyed. Typically an Enigma coming out of a battlefield looks like this, or looks like this. They're destroyed by hand grenades. Digging for them in the mud is not a lot of fun. And here we'll take you on a little Enigma hunt for the Enigma that was used by General Manteuffel, the 3rd Panzer Division. He's a tank commander. And he was forced to surrender to the British right up at the end of the war, just before the end of the war. And the British turned the area where he was camping into a concentration camp for them, and that allowed him to bury the Enigma machines there. And somehow we got in contact with a man who his avocation is digging up battlefields, and he told us that he had managed to find an Enigma. And here's some of the pictures of his dig. The Enigma was buried about 1 meter, 3 feet down in the battlefield mud. And in the process of digging up the Enigma, a lot of other war materials come up. Digging anywhere in a battlefield these days is extremely, extremely dangerous because the munitions are very unstable. If you come across a hand grenade, just jiggle it, the firing pin mechanism will have rusted severely and it's liable to go off. So every year a few treasure hunters end up killing themselves digging in battlefields. When I was much younger, I took both of my sons across Germany with a metal locator, and we happily went through battlefields and dug up pieces of metal. Just pure luck that we didn't blow ourselves up. But it's extremely dangerous. Any of these things could have been a grenade, highly explosive. And anyway, dig a little further, and there the plug board of an Enigma machine begins to appear in the mud, and you dig it out a little bit. You have to use a pretty strong metal detector to get down 3 feet. Dig it out, clean it off a little bit, and here it is cleaned off. And you'll find it sitting right up here on the table for you to look at. So you've seen the unearthing of the machine that you have in front of you. We find a lot of interesting things by studying these Enigma machines. This one had a bullet hole in it, right where the pistol is pointing there, and we were able to measure the diameter of the bullet hole and discover that it was made by a 7.65 Mauser, and that is the type of pistol that was used primarily by officers during the war. So you derive from that that machines were probably destroyed by officers, at least some of them. Here's a perfectly normal-looking lake in Germany, and we had heard that the Germans had thrown things in the lake at the end of the war. So, thrown things, that sounds exciting. Let's get our metal locator out and go diving in the lake. And the man who did this took his metal locator, went over the lake, and the visibility in the lake is approximately 1 inch, which means if you have a face mask on, you can see your finger if it's 1 inch in front of your eyes, but no further. So you have to do your metal locating by ear. You put on a pair of earphones, and you use an underwater metal locator, and you sweep across the wreckage on the bottom of the lake until you get a contact, then you reach up and grab the contact and bring it up to the surface. And here are some of the things that were brought up out of this lake. Some German radios were thrown in, special devices that were part of a propeller speed sensing device for German torpedoes, and, of all things, an Enigma machine. Unfortunately, the man with the metal locator who was operating it at the time, he reached up and he realized he had an Enigma machine in his hand, and he got so excited that he dropped the metal locator and headed up for the surface. I got an Enigma! And we've never found the metal locator after that. The visibility was so incredibly bad, we didn't have a backup one to find it with either. The Enigma machine that cost us a metal locator is right there. And when you see a machine like this, you want to do an autopsy on it. Well, how did that machine die? Well, typically the Germans would kick in the plug board on the front of the Enigma with their boot, and then the question is, how did they bend the light bulb panel like that? And the bend looked sort of suspicious to me, and we thought about it for a while, and we said, you know, that looks a little bit familiar. Why don't we go over and see Charlie, who has a German Mauser, and we'll see if his Mauser fits into that bend. And sure enough, the Mauser, the butt of the Mauser fit exactly into the bend in the light bulb panel on the Enigma. We were able to discover then that the Mauser had been used to destroy the Enigma machine. How about submarines? Every submarine had an Enigma machine in it. So why don't we go diving for submarine Enigmas? Well, it's quite difficult to do that. U-352 was sunk as it torpedoed ships off the coast of North Carolina. And it's now looked like that back then. It now looks like this, a wreck sitting on the bottom. And the penetration of a submarine is extremely dangerous. I'm not sure whether it's more dangerous or less dangerous than digging in battlefields, but they're both pretty scary to do. Anyway, here's a man penetrating the wreck of U-352 with double tank scuba tanks on, and you can see it's a tight fit, and getting back out again is a little bit troublesome, especially since you can't help but stirring up a lot of dust and rust inside the boat. But if you're able to do that, you dig around in the radio room long enough, you may be lucky enough to be able to bring up an Enigma machine. And this is an Enigma machine that has been buried in a U-boat for 70 years. And you can see it's not in the greatest of condition. But Enigma machines in this condition are of great historic value. And a number of museums make displays of Enigma machines like this, since they can't afford fully restored Enigma machines typically. Very few Enigma machines actually survived the war and the post-war period. This machine is in beautiful condition. It's a Navy Enigma machine, and the guy who's holding it is a total nutcase. He's sitting in a German World War II Messerschmitt Me-109 fighter that he is restoring and planning to fly. It's in his garage, and he's too old to fly that machine, but he is bound and determined. He's going to fly that Me-109 out of his at the local airport. And so he contacted me because he knew I was interested in collecting Enigmas. And he said, "I hear you looking for an Enigma. I want an engine for my Me-109 fighter." And so I found him an engine for his Me-109 fighter. He had actually found it. I gave him the money to buy it, and he gave me the Enigma. So sometimes you have to go to rather extraordinary ends to get Enigma machines from people. Here's another guy. This guy said, "Why don't you come over and let me show you the Enigma machine? I think I'm going to sell it to you." And he spent most of his time caressing his machine gun and telling us about all the things he'd done during World War II. At one point, he pointed to me and he said, "You know, you're an American, and 50 years ago, I would have shot you right between the eyes." And I could almost feel it. He's pointing at me, and then he puts on this big smile that you see up there, and he says, "And here I am selling you an Enigma machine." You get a little spooky things going on there. And the big moment for us was when we went into the living room of a guy, and he said, "You know, I think I have a couple of Enigma machines under the cabinet here in my living room." And so we're waiting and waiting, and he reaches under there, and out comes one Enigma machine, and then another Enigma machine, and then another Enigma machine, and he says, "What will you give me for them?" And that was the first moment we set eyes on the Enigma that you may have seen in the Imitation Game. So that's the Enigma that showed up in the Imitation Game. We ended up buying all three of them from him and learning his story, and it's quite fascinating to hunt for these machines. This is the Enigma that we bought from him. We took it apart, restored it, made sure it was in working condition, and sold it to Bletchley Park. And Bletchley Park then loaned it to the Imitation Game movie. But it was nice to see that Enigma on the big screen. Enigmas, maybe 367 of them if you count the marine Enigmas, and maybe 40,000 of them were made. They have been selling for increasingly high prices. The Enigma sold in 2012 for about $45,000, in 2014 for $124,000, 2018 $265,000, and I just received word from my wife we have an Enigma machine that's going up for auction tomorrow, and it has already reached the cost to the buyer of over $305,000. So it's absolutely amazing. We're very careful with these machines, as you can well imagine. What kind of nuts buy Enigmas for that kind of money? Hell, you could buy a Rolls Royce for less money than an Enigma machine, a new Rolls Royce. Well, this guy is the former chief technical officer for Apple Computing, and he's just delighted with his Enigma machine. As a matter of fact, he has gradually become one of the great Enigma historians, and he must have, what do you think, 10 different cipher machines like that at this point. This is a museum. Very few museums can afford Enigma machines, but this museum was able to afford one, and it's on display. It was on display at the Chatham Marconi Museum. Here's a picture of the kind of nutty people that we hang out with. These are all Enigma historians with some of their Enigmas out front. This was a get-together at Bletchley Park back in 2009. We drank a lot of beer and talked Enigma all night long. A lot of fun. What about the other cipher machines? Well, the Germans had their Enigma machine, but the Americans used a device called the M209 cipher machine. I have one of those for you to look at and play with up here. The M209 is a mechanical machine, basically similar in overall idea with the Enigma. You set a little letter over here across from that index as the plain text letter that you're trying to encipher, and turn the handle over here, and the ciphertext letter is printed out on a little piece of paper tape. No battery in these, they're just purely mechanical, but fairly complicated mechanical devices. If you look at the rotors closely, you'll see that the spacing between the letters on the rotors is very different. Over here, you can see they're widely spaced, and over here, they're closely spaced. And there are all these little slider things up here that make the encoding of the message extremely complex. Setting the day's key on a machine like this involves setting the starting setting of the rotors, but also setting this slider matrix back in there. It was a little easier for the Germans to crack the M209 than it was for us to crack the Enigma machine, but it was still used fairly widely in situations where the Americans had to have absolute total secrecy. They used a device called the American SIGAVA. And the SIGAVA is so secret and so well kept, the secrets are so well kept, that we've never been able to turn up a surplus SIGAVA. They are still classified and hidden away, and nobody is really sure exactly what the wiring or the internal settings are like on a SIGAVA. The Russians were also involved in building cipher machines after the end of World War II. As I said, they used the Enigma machines to some extent, but they also designed a device that they codenamed Fialka, the Russian word for purple or violet. And this machine, much more complicated than an Enigma machine. You'll see that it has a total of 10 rotors instead of the 3 in an Enigma. The rotors rotate in opposite directions to each other, and there is a little paper card reader on the side that serves the same purpose as the plug board on the front of the Enigma machine. So it's extremely difficult. NASA refuses to either accept or deny the fact that they are able to crack the Russian Fialka. So we don't know for sure whether the NSA, that is able to read those messages, but probably they have learned to crack the Fialka code. And finally, we look at the Harris RF310, which is the absolute latest in enciphered radio equipment. It is today's Enigma. We have one down at the end of the table for you to look at. It has inside it the equivalent of an Enigma machine, an electronic Enigma machine, and so it is over there to look at. So we have all these things, starting with the Civil War code wheel, going through the Enigma to the M209 Fialka, Fialka and the enciphered radio at the end for you to come up and look at, as well as a copy of Inside Enigma, the second edition of our book, available at half price at the end there. And back to the display on the front table then, thank you. Let me hear if there are any questions from anybody. Yes?
In one of the pictures, there was something about a four-rotor Enigma?
Yes, the Dönitz got scared when all of his submarines were being sunk. And so he took the standard three-rotor Enigma and modified it by making the reflector smaller and sneaked a fourth wheel in there. And there are not a lot of those around. They typically sell for about over $500,000, 550,000, and they are more difficult to crack. But Turing was on top of that, and the ridiculous thing was that Dönitz had this machine designed for him. He said, "I'm on a machine that you can't read as easily as a three-rotor machine." Right. And Goering, head of the Air Force, Goering was it, said, no, you can't do that. My Air Force guys won't be able to read your Enigma messages. And the only way I'll let you do that is if you make the four-rotor Enigma so that it works exactly like a three-rotor Enigma if you keep the fourth rotor in the A position. So that was just an incredible giveaway to the Allies who were trying to crack this, because they knew that it was completely the same as a three-rotor Enigma except for the position of that last rotor. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Did the Germans have trouble, especially on the U-boats or the Kriegsmarine, with corrosion?
Say it again.
Did the Germans have trouble with corrosion, especially in a naval application?
These Enigmas are amazingly resilient, and they don't seem to have problems. The one problem that exists is that the Germans did not use gold or silver or platinum contacts on the rotors. So you would expect that there would be problems with corrosion. And I don't remember ever hearing anyone complain of corrosion on a Marine Enigma, do you?
As long as they were used.
As long as they were used, yeah. The Enigma really needs to be used, because without gold, silver, or platinum, the brass-on-brass contacts are not very reliable. Anyone else? Well, yes.
So if it's 300,000 for one of these Enigma machines,
Yes.
I'm assuming that's because that's one of the original ones from
Yeah.
the World War II era. If someone were to try and make a replica today, how much would that cost?
We have a man that works with us in Germany, and he made 10 replicas. And they were so exact, he put over 600 man-hours into each one. They were so exact that even the flaw with the Enigma was present in his replica. So the flaw is that there's a little part that binds after a while. So this was unbelievably complete, and he charged $55,000 a piece for the replica.
Awesome.
So it's right up there because it's so complex. Now, the neat thing is, if you have a smartphone, and I assume everyone in the room has a smartphone, you can put an Enigma in your smartphone for free. Just look up an Enigma app, and you'll have one right in your smartphone. And it's so good that it'll decipher real Enigma messages, both Army and Marine. So don't hesitate to do that. Any other questions? Yes?
When computers rotate, does it matter what letter has been struck? Or do they rotate the same regardless of the question? I guess I'm wondering, does it matter what the message says as to the orientation of the next rotor set?
Does it clarify a little bit?
So when you hit a key, the rotor strike.
Yeah.
Do they turn differently if you hit an A versus an E?
No, they're always stepping, like the odometer on a car. The right-hand rotor steps 26 times, kicks the middle rotor once, and that one goes 26 times, kicks the left-hand rotor once. Doesn't matter what letter you're typing in, they're always using that kind of rotational sequence. Unlike this incredible Fialka, Russian Fialka, where everything's going in every which way, you can't even begin to understand what it's doing. Anyone else? Well, please feel free to come up here, look at the machines, touch the machines. We'll be here to answer your questions. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Yes. I have a picture of the